Okay, great. So we're back, and what I've done is I've resized this so that the code becomes much more legible. And what's kind of interesting about this is we already have a buyer class, that's accessible to us, and there are various, methods accessible to the buyer. One thing I wanted to quickly review about Eclipse that I like a great deal is I can press the control key, not the control, but the in Apple, it's like the Apple key, or Windows, it's the special, Windows key, and you can press that, and you can actually open up the buyer class. So that opens up right over here. So I'm trying to work with the buyer, and I say, okay, well, let's open up buyer and see what's inside of it. And some of the key things that we needed to make for the buyer is you need to establish the budget, the buyer name. We need to prove that the buyer exists, and then we need to build a random portfolio. So here a lot of this is not really done yet, so I figured we could work with these three methods today, because really we need a couple of crucial details. And let's just detail these here. First, we need to know the buyer's budget, and that will determine randomly. Second, we need to know the number of stock transactions she plans to make. Now, a transaction is equal to a number of stock at a given price. So when you think about, once you know the number of stock, so if you know the number of transactions and you take your budget and you divide it by that number of transactions, what you end up with is an allocation per share, or an APS value, which is kind of like the budget, or the allocation per transaction rather, which is a budget per transaction. Okay? So that's quite interesting. So we really need to have those three things. So, building the random portfolio, that's going to be built upon a couple of other things that we need to know. And so let's make sure, A, that we have the budget. So what we say is, okay, that's step one. And before we can build out the portfolio, we're actually going to have to establish number of transactions. Which should help us to determine step two. Then we should establish APS, which is going to be step three, which is the budget per transaction. Maybe we should call this the APT instead, the allocation per transaction. Okay, so let's go ahead and establish these methods. Establish number of transaction, and then establish the allocation per transaction. Establish APT. No, that's what I want. Great. We hadn't worked with the buyer for a little while, so here we are. Let's just prove that we're recording. Very good. So let's say this. First of all, the budget is the first critical statistic. So that should be the budget right there. So we already have a variable called budget. So probably we're going to need to have an integer called the number of transactions. and that's going to be determined randomly. And that's going to be established number of transactions, established budget. So we're going to call this good to go. Established number of transactions is going to be easy. And then APT is the budget per transaction. And when you're thinking about budget, that's going to be kind of a currency number. So I'm going to say APT is going to be my allocation per transaction, or the dollar budgeted per transaction of stock. So let's get busy making number of transactions. So what I can do is I can go down to that implementation right there. First of all, num transactions, that's the variable that I want to be able to set. So naturally I'm going to run into my random, and then I could say num transactions is going to be r.next integer. And maybe what we'll create is we'll create a ceiling of 25. So we'll make a limit of 25 transactions. Okay. And then we'll call that good for now. We'll need to test that. And then why don't we say, a good way to test that would be to say system out print line from transactions equal to num transactions. Okay. Now let me say that one thing that working in an object-oriented milieu does for you is it creates understandability. Understand that programming is a very limited set of operations. It has to do with variables. It has to do with methods. It has to do with if-then, for loops, and classes, and that's it. That's all the programming can be. So once you know that that's the limit of the knowledge that you need to know, you guys are pretty much, probably 95% of Java right now. Does that make sense? So it's probably time to get done with the mystique surrounding programmers. Probably we just need to know that these are people who are smart, but they're just really dedicated to knowing programming. So for you guys, here you are doing all these classes, but really they're easy. They're strings, they're if-then, there are a lot of random numbers. Probably by this point there's nothing new that's happening, and things are starting to calm down a little bit. And you realize that you're kind of seeing the extent of programming at this point. And there's more to do. There's a lot more to do, but you know a vast amount already. So that's going to prove the number of transactions. I'd also like to prove the budget, and that's prove establishment. And that's fine. What I wouldn't mind doing is just saying system.out.println budget is set to plus the budget. Now that variable budget is not declared for the first time right there. It's actually instant. It's actually it's initialized, which is setting an initial value to something, but it's actually declared long before. So these are declarations up here. So let's just put this up here just so you have a sense of formality. Declarations follow. And so those are really two important building blocks. And now I feel pretty good about our programming. So I'm going to move forward into that third statistic, which is the APT. And for any given class, you should kind of document things like this, where we say APT expresses the amount we can spend per transaction given whatever price is per stock, which will differ per transaction. And then what we'll say is, understand the portfolio is a collection of groups of stock we purchased, we bought, otherwise known as transactions. Okay? Just so we have a vocabulary that means something. It's typical in an engineering context that the engineer sort of is creating something, so he or she has to create a vocabulary that encompasses what they've made, and the efficiency of the vocabulary allows other people to learn the technology better, right? And it enables them to build things faster too. So the allocation per transaction is very easy, and so we'll say that, and we've already defined APT, so we're going to say that APT is going to be equal to budget divided by number of transactions. And that's just going to be very simple. And the fact that we put in a bit of work to create number of transactions and budget earlier means that APT just moves into place, and then we should say something like system.out.println allocated budget per transaction is APT. Okay? So the fact that we kind of throw these methods right here inside of the buyer's constructor is helpful to us because we can just make a new buyer and then feasibly, print num transaction, APT, budget. Those are critical building blocks. So let's do the market, and let's make a buyer, and yeah, let's see where we're at. Let's see what kind of errors we're producing or what have you. Okay, so this is the market. Your 6,000 odd equities are there, and then your budget of that buyer is set to this, and it's quite a big budget. That's seven zeros. So it's a pretty healthy, $1 billion budget. That's good. And then the buyer, and that's their ID, I suppose, has a budget of that. And the number of transactions they can make is 16. So we can spend approximately 678,000 per transaction. Does that sound reasonable? We're kind of positioning the buyer to go out and go shopping. And we're saying, well, here's really how much you get to spend. Because we want to put ourselves in a position where we can make hundreds of thousands of buyers, where each of them has different decision-making paths. So that's a pretty good start. And what I might do is just kind of shut this video down, because now the next thing is we need to build the random portfolio. And this is going to be an important step where we're going to see our little formula here, our algorithm. Our little algorithm here, our strategy is to say, take the budget, get number of transactions, determine our allocation per transaction. Fine. Then we're going to say, get the market, randomly choose a stock to buy. Get the price of the chosen stock, then divide allocation per transaction by the stock's price. Step 3 provides a volume of stock, or a number of stock, to buy. Then 5, make a transaction wherein you buy the APT, or rather you buy the number of stock in step 4. Then step 6, push the transaction into the buyer's portfolio. Now, some of the things that we get used to here in programming is we figure one thing leads to another. If we can do one thing, we can make that lead to another. And we're really good at building these kind of Rube Goldberg machines, where you make something that causes something else to happen. And we think about processes that we set in motion. And so everything in programming has to happen in order. And when they happen in order, we eventually make something. The only reason why you can patent a piece of software is that you ultimately start with something and then you end up with another thing. And that mode of transformation is what we're trying to do. So we began with a market, now we're going to create some buyers. But the buyers need to have portfolios, right? So, so this order is going to be important to us. Now we come back, what I want to do is, I think we're pretty good with step 1. But next we want to go and we want to spend a little attention on getting steps 2 through 6, which will take a little bit of strategy. So why don't you go ahead, take a little break to get a breather, and what we'll do is we'll prove that we have a bit of a budget here, and that needs to be made positive. But we're able to roughly get a budget. Now this person's budget was nice and small. It was only $869,000, right? And so why don't we do this? Let's just purify the budget, just in case we get a random number. Budget is set to budget. And what we'll say is, if a budget is less than 0, i.e. if it's a negative, budget should be equal to itself times -1. And that should turn it positive. And let's just do that a few times to see if that'll be, okay, that's fine. Big budget. Big budget. Budget is set to, allocated budget per trans. Budget is set to, okay. So we got to fix that. So it sometimes comes up negative. Budget is set to, and I think probably we'll just take that out, and then we'll say, we'll put that right down there, which is the right time to report. Okay, and we'll see if that, we'll try it a few times, and we'll see how that goes. Okay, that's probably going to be, it's probably going to work. So it looks like we're in an interesting position to move forward. So join me, remember to subscribe, and we'll do the next video in a moment.